here. And man, one thing real quick I want to say about our worship team that was just up here. I was here earlier while they were practicing, and here's what you need to know that's so cool about our people that do this. There was no difference between what they were doing in practice when no one was here and what they were doing with all of you here, because they're not doing it for you or for me. They're doing it to the Lord. And it was so fun to see them dancing and eyes closed and hands up to virtually an empty room and just going for it. So thank you guys for just leading us so wonderfully. Yeah. Well, all right, so let's get started. I want to start off with talking about there's a lot of things in life that don't make sense, right? The fact that Utah drivers still can't figure out a roundabout is hard to understand. The fact that we still sing happy birthday to people in restaurants and nobody likes it. The waiters don't like it. The birthday person doesn't like it. If you're singing, you don't like it. Or the fact, people will say things like, it goes without saying, right before saying a lot of stuff. And so none of that makes sense. And here's the thing. There's a lot of things in life that don't make sense. But a lot of them ultimately aren't that big of a deal. And we can kind of just, okay, I'm just going to drive safer now in Utah or whatever it may be. But one thing that kind of is a big deal when it doesn't make sense is when God doesn't make sense. That's different. That's like when God doesn't make sense, that's hard. That's challenging. That's like, oh man, what do I do? What do I do with that? And I would venture to say that if you have walked with God for longer than 12 months, you've bumped up against this at some point. You've already bumped up against it where it was just like, oh man, I don't know what's going on right now. I mean, you've went through something in your life or you've went through something in your faith that has just left you confused, disappointed, or frustrated, and maybe even for some of you. This confusion and frustration lasted so long, it led to disillusionment. You began to wonder if because of all the bad things that has happened in your life or to people you know in your life, if God is even good. And maybe even, you're here and you're beginning to move from not just disillusionment about whether he's good, but whether he's even real, whether he even exists. I mean, after all, if God is good, why do so many bad things exist in our world? Why do so many bad things exist in my life? And so when we were putting together this series, and if you're just arriving here at Crossroads, welcome. You're at the final part of this 4-part series, When God Doesn't Make Sense. You can go to YouTube, type in Crossroads Go, and you can kind of catch up, and I will do a little bit of a recap on it. But when we were planning it, there was a group of us that got together to plan out this series. There was a couple things we knew. One, we knew it was critical that we address real things that real people experience with their faith and their walk with God, which meant we would have to deal with some real questions that people are asking. Now, often, us religious people, due to fear or other reasons, we don't voice those questions because maybe we feel like we'll be judged, but sometimes we just have them in our heart or they're swirling around in our mind. And so we knew, for one, we needed to address some real things about our faith and about the God that we worship. And then we also knew when we were planning this out, it was so clear to all of us that we would not be able to effectively pin anything onto the ground so completely that everyone would just leave satisfied and go, now nothing doesn't make sense. Everything about God now makes sense. We just knew that we couldn't pin everything to the ground so effectively as that. Because there are just some things you just can't pin to the ground. There are some things, in fact, I would argue there are many, many things, not just with our faith, just in life, but in particular our faith that we just have to wrestle with. And we don't know if we ever pin it to the ground. But we just wrestle with it, and we wrestle with it, and we wrestle with it. And I think all of us are guaranteed, whether we're religious or irreligious, a believer or someone who's not sure about all that. I think we all have points in our life that leave us very confused. Hard things in life that we try to work real hard to make sense of, and maybe we're not able to. And if you've ever read the Bible, We know, and I know from having read it for many years now, that from the historical writings to the poems, to the songs, to the biographies, to the personal letters that are written in what we call the Bible, that the confusion with life and God that we experience is very similar to the confusion with life and God everyone has experienced from the beginning who has ever walked with God. And so we thought, okay, man, just about anybody you can flip open the Bible and turn to has struggled with this. And I know sometimes, especially if you grew up in church, we read about these people, and man, they're just cast as like they're just enormous giants of faith. And yes, we did have a lot of that, but man, they had some doubt, they had some fear, they had some questions, they had some concerns. And so we were talking about this. We go, you know what do we do? Because we can't pin everything to the ground, but there is something we can do. And it's something that the first followers did. And that was this, to trust in God's character in life's confusion. That we would trust in his character. Not trust in our circumstances, which are confusing and perplexing and sometimes beyond our ability to control or manipulate or change. That the first followers, when life was confusing, they held on to his character, who he was, his nature. That when life is confusing for us, when things are slipping through our fingers, the one thing we can and what I would encourage all of us to hold on to is God's character, that God is good. And God is good just doesn't even really hit it, because it's deeper than that. It's more beautiful than that. It's more lovely than that. It's more expansive than just God is good. In fact, John, one of Jesus' closest friends and disciples, would later go about writing down the teachings he heard from Jesus. And this is one of the things he wrote down that Jesus said. He wrote it in his letter about God. He says this in 1 John 4:8. God is love. He's just not nice. He's just not kind. He's love. It's just deeper than being good. That his DNA, the substance of his very being is love. And we are free to ask God any of our questions, but God wants to assure you and remind me that we need not ever question his love, because he is, and he does. But come on, let's be real. How many of us have questions God's love for us in the midst of a storm, in the midst of a trial, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of a painful experience? Count me as one of those people who has done that. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, multiple times in different seasons of my life that were just so hard. I'm in a season of life that is hard. And I've sometimes struggled with going, God, what is your character in all of this? What am I going to hold on to right now? Because, as it relates to God's love, we just don't always see it. We don't always feel it. I love that song we just sang, even when I don't feel it. If you're here today and someone has ever told you that your walk with God is just going to be this emotional high where it's just goosebumps and tingly feelings all the time, they lied to you. I don't know why they did that. They obviously don't like you. It is not true. Emotions are great. But man, it is so much bigger than my fleeting emotions. And so, how many of you ever thought to yourself in a season of life that was tough, God, are you punishing me? God, do you have it out for me? Have I done something to offend you right now? We have these questions, right? And man, sometimes religious environments can be terribly judgmental places, unfortunately. They're supposed to be the exact opposite of that, but you may even have some religious people going, I think it is you. And so part 1, we talked about Job. Job had friends just like maybe you had friends. And that's not to say nothing that happens to us is never our fault. Of course, we can make foolish decisions and suffer for it. But what we talked about in part 1 of this series is what you're going through may have nothing to do with you. What you're going through may have nothing to do with you. And that was part of Job's story. And that's what the disciples went to Jesus, and then they saw a crippled person, and they're like, hey, Jesus, Why is this guy crippled? Is it because of him and all the nasty stuff he did? Or was it his parents' nasty stuff that they did that God then punished the kid? I mean, they thought just like Job's friends thought, just like maybe some of your friends think. Maybe even sometimes you think about yourself when you're going through a tough time. What have I done? God, why do you have it out for me? Why am I the ant and you're the boot? Like, what's going on, right? Or maybe you're here today and you just feel like God is always running late. You're like, time is of the essence. Why don't you show up and say something or do something like now? Like, please do something now. You are running late. I mean, you've maybe thought to yourself, where were you when I needed you? Maybe for some of you, that's why you've walked away from God or walked away from church, and maybe you're just watching online from a distance, or you're here and you're kind of inching your way back, but you're just not sure because he so disappointed you, because he didn't feel like he showed up for you. And so a couple weeks ago, we talked about that God's delays are not necessarily God's denials. That he may have, let's say it this way. You will experience divine delays. Divine delays. God orchestrated delays, and it doesn't make any sense. And you're just like, I don't want any divine delays. Just show up. Please just show up. I think if we were all be honest in one way or another, we've questioned God's character, or at least had a few questions we wanted to run by him. So part of the big reason we're doing this series is not only to encourage you to trust in God's character when life is confusing, but to also encourage you to ask questions. And when I mean ask questions, I mean nothing is off limits. Nothing is off limits. You can ask whatever. You can ask whatever you want. Nothing. Let me say it again. Nothing is off limits. I know sometimes religious cultures, religious churches, that is like the last place you ask a question. I mean, we don't even talk about sex up here, let alone other things, right? I mean, come on, like nothing is off limits. I think for some of you, that's why you're here this morning, because you just need to hear that. Your questions are important. Your questions are important to us, and your questions are important to Jesus. You know, religious people in general, and Christians in particular, are often accused of having turned their brains off. And I think we have to own a little bit of that from my opinion. I think we have to own a little bit of that because I think far too long religious leaders have made their religious followers feel guilty and ashamed and condemned and judged for asking questions and having doubts. And I can understand how somebody can become too afraid to ask a question. Because in your mind, you're feeling like if I ask a question, my peers and my leaders are going to start asking questions about me. What is wrong with her? Where is his faith? What sins do you think they're hiding? One of my favorite moments as a dad of 2 kids is when they ask me questions. Now, that comes with a caveat. It's not like so much, are we there yet? Or can I have the last piece of pizza? Which the answers to both are no. You can't. It's just no. But I love when they ask questions about life and love. I love when they ask questions about life and the world. I love being able to stimulate their thinking. I love when I just go, ask anything. Ask anything about God. It doesn't matter. Tell me how you're feeling about this. Tell me how you're feeling about your mom being sick. Just tell me what you're thinking about God right now. And they'll be like, well, what about this? And what about that? I'm like, all right, let's talk about that. Let's stay there and let's talk about that. And I'm sorry if you've ever been in a religious environment that has tried to stomp that out of you. I don't think we're supposed to discourage thinking. And it's not because I'm like some authority. I think because Jesus said that. And so let me read you a verse Jesus said to his followers. And it's recorded in Matthew chapter 22. He says, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart. We know that one. Most of us remember that one. And with all your soul. Most of us in church go, yeah, I remember that one. Almost all of us forget this one. And with your mind. I want you to love me with your mind. Oh, I thought I was supposed to just turn that off and have blind faith. Jesus is like, no. Love me with your mind. Love me with your thinking. Love me with your curiosity. Love me with your questions. I mean, he literally commands us to love God with the mind God has given us. We're to love him with our deep thoughts. We're to love him with our meditations. We're to love him by contemplating his teachings and his ways. And I know some of you here today are watching online who you have your doubts, you have your questions. You lack an understanding about what it is that you're going through. To you, God maybe isn't making any sense right now. And if that is you, I'm glad you're here. And if that is not you, it'll be you at some point in the near future. So if that's you at all, count yourself among the many who have gone before you where God did not make sense and they were confused by life's circumstances. People like Noah and Moses and Job and Jacob and King David and the prophet Habakkuk and Peter and James and John and Elijah and Adam. No, not that Adam, this Adam. I mean, many before us have wrestled with God, asked tough questions, and had to hold on to the nature of his character to help us get us through confusing times. I just want to give you a couple examples of this. I'm telling you, I could spend all morning just doing this. Here's just a couple examples from scriptures of this kind of thing happening. Let's go to Psalms 22. God, my God, exclamation mark. Why would you abandon me now? Why do you remain distant? Silent. My tearful cries in the day. My desperate cries for you help in the night. The writer is laying there going, you see me, and I know you love me, but you're seeing me cry, and I feel like you should do something about what is making me cry. I can't stop sobbing. Where are you? This would be something they would sing. So I think we should one night just have the most depressing worship night of all time, where these are the lyrics to the songs that we sing. I don't know. It might be pretty healing. We'd all go, oh man. This was written a long time ago, a couple thousand, more than a few thousand years ago. So what you're going through is not unique to you. This is somebody who loved God and was loved by God. Here's another example, Psalm 22. This is the same thing, but in the King James Version. Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? I mean, come on, I'm just not talking. I'm not whispering. Psalm 10, verse 1. I love this. Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Doesn't he feel so distant in tough times? Doesn't he seem so silent sometimes in tough times? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? So he's like, you're not even just not there. I feel like this is the worst game of hide and seek ever. Like, you're back here. I don't want to play a game. This isn't a time for games. I just want you to be here present with me. Where and why? Can anyone relate to this writer? So I want to tell you about one of the people I just mentioned. His name was Elijah. He was a prophet. And my hope is that by telling you just a little bit about his story, you'll find your story. Someone you can relate with. And I also hope that by hearing a little bit of his story, that you can arrive at a different conclusion that he arrived at. That we could avoid the mistake that he made in drawing his conclusions from what he was going through so that we don't make it. Because the conclusions he drew from his scenario left him more lonely than ever, disappointed, and entirely defeated. So before I tell you about his story, I want to ask you about your story. How many of you, rhetorical question, have ever experienced something like this? You're desperate to hear from God, but you hear and sense nothing. You're like, God, that doesn't make sense, that I don't sense anything. You're praying, and at some point, it feels like a very one-directional conversation. meaning you to him. You're praying and asking God to give you wisdom, and you feel like you hear and receive nothing. You're praying and you're pleading with God to speak to you, but all you experience is the sound of the silence is deafening, right? The silence can be painful. And it can be incredibly, that was awesome. Nobody likes silence, including train conductors. That was awesome. I'll tell you this is true. I love this. Don't we hate silence? Not even if we're in trouble or like trying to hear from God, don't we? Isn't silence just awkward? It's so funny when we're like planning our services, how often like I'll say, or someone will say, make sure we got something happening. We need a song here. We can't have any like dead. Like if the music dies, everyone dies. Everyone will die if there is silence in this place, right? It's just the most, I don't know why. We just got to keep things going. And I'm telling you, me and you, we've probably all built our lives around that. The avoidance of silence. Most of us. We've just like, get that out. It is like, how do we get rid of that from our lives? So whenever we feel like we're experiencing from God, I mean, silence is already hard enough, let alone if it's happening with God. Silence can be very, very tough. So let me tell you just a little bit about Elijah. There's so much about his story, and it's really cool and dramatic. But I just want to give you a quick update. He was a prophet, meaning he would see and speak and hear from God's perspective, and then he would share it with God's people. So God would share with him, give him wisdom and something, he would give it to the people. He was a man who loved God. He was a man loved by God. He faithfully served God. And God used Elijah to do incredibly miraculous things. But despite all of this, Elijah is going to go from a really mountaintop high to a deep, deep valley of loneliness and hopelessness. And I wish I could tell you the funny story that leads to his mountaintop high. It is, oh my gosh. You just know they weren't making this stuff up and writing it out. It happened as they actually happened. As Elijah takes on all these false prophets that were telling people to worship all these false gods. So that they have like this contest, our God against all your fake gods. And Elijah wins, and he starts sarcastically mocking the other prophets, and because their gods didn't show up. So he says things like, maybe they're going to the bathroom, and that's why they haven't come yet. It's really funny. And I really like Elijah, and we named our son Elijah. So, really great. So he has this huge victory, huge monumental victory where God proves himself that he's the one true God, and the false prophets are killed and running for their lives, and God shows all the people that he's the one true God. So he's like legendary. He's like, does not get better than this. Well, at the time, his king, King Ahab, was a corrupt king. He was an evil king. And Ahab didn't like Elijah. So they put a price on his head after this moment. So he goes from like, woo, yeah, to like, oh. So now Elijah's running. He's running for his life. In fact, if you've never heard of King Ahab, you've probably heard of his wife, even if you've never read the Bible. And you'll know something about his wife just by when I tell you her name. Her name was Jezebel. Okay. So some of you, that means nothing. Ask your parents, and they'll tell you why they didn't name you Jezebel. Okay. They'll tell you what it means. They'll just fill you in the whole way, all right? No, we don't name our daughters Jezebel because of this Jezebel, right? Her name was Jezebel. It started with her. She ruined the whole thing, and she was really bad. She hated Elijah. They had a price on his head, so Elijah goes running for his life, and he's now in the deepest valley in his heart and in his mind. So we're going to hop into a story found in the ancient manuscript called 1 Kings. It's in the Old Testament. And here we go, chapter 19. It says, then he, talking about Elijah, went alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He's getting the heck out of town. I'm going to travel all day to get away. He finally sat down under, and I love this, a solitary broom tree. No idea what that is. I know what that is. And I just love the picture of that. He's alone with like one tree. Like I picture like the Charlie Brown tree, just like this pathetic, sad tree that he's sitting, a solitary broom tree. And again, saddest prayer ever prayed. And prayed that he might die. Like he is down. He is at an all-time low after having just come off of an all-time high. And he said to God, take my life. Some of you have prayed that. Some of you have thought that. I have prayed this prayer. I prayed this prayer, not even knowing it was a prayer from Elijah, when I was a young adult. And I didn't want to live anymore. I would pray, God, just take my life. Whatever you want to do. Car accident, whatever you want to. I don't care how you do it. Take my life. I can relate to that prayer. Maybe some of you can relate to that kind of despair and hopelessness. And I'm telling you this right now. Some of you have friends that are praying that prayer. Maybe not be to God. They may not even know who God is, but they're wanting this. They want their life to end. And he said, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. He's saying dead people are better off than me right now. So he is at an all-time low. So he falls asleep under his tree. And then he wakes up and he travels to Mount Sinai. Now, to Elijah, Mount Sinai would have been everything. To a Hebrew, one of the followers of God, Mount Sinai would have meant everything. They called it the mountain of God because if you remember Moses and the story of Exodus, Mount Sinai is where God would show up and his presence would be there and he would like speak to Moses. So Elijah's like, I'm going to Mount Sinai. This is like epic. This is the place. This is the mountain. So he packs up and heads to what he would call the mountain of God. And here he begins to pray some more. And Elijah says, I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty. And I love this. I don't know why he prayed these exact words, but I've done this in tough times. I've been like, God, I've done this for you. And I've done that for you. Hey, do you need to see my resume? Do I need to remind you of all that I've done for you? I've walked with you. And then I love it because then he brings other people into it. Like, no one else is, but this guy is. I should be special to you. I should be unique to you. He said, but the people of Israel, his people, they have broken their covenant with you. It'd be like they divorced themselves from their gods so they could marry and sleep around with all these false gods, so to speak. They broke their covenant with you. They tore down your altars, places of worship, and killed every one of your prophets. And I'm the only one left. I'm it. Everyone else ran away. And I love this. Not only does he give him his resume, but he exaggerates the stats a little bit because he wasn't the only one left. God would tell him, hey, by the way, there's like 7,000 others. He's like, But when you're hurting, when you're desperate, you don't care about that. If you got to exaggerate the stats for effect with God, you got to do what you got to do to get his attention. Come on, look at my resume. I'm the only one. No one else in my family, not my husband, not my kids. It's me. I'm the one doing this. And now they're trying to kill me too, which was true. So that actually was bad news. See, when Elijah was at his lowest, he drew the wrong conclusion about his circumstances. Elijah made the mistake I have made. Elijah let what he didn't see change what he thought was reality. Elijah let his feelings betray his faith. And this is something that is so easy to do and so natural to do. And I've done it many, many, many times. Because when life got confusing for Elijah confused God's silence for his absence. And here's what I want to encourage us to do, is never mistake God's silence for his absence. Never mistake God's silence for his absence. Never deduce, never come to the conclusion, because it's silent, he must be absent. He must not be there. He must not love me. He must not care for me. It's so natural to do. It is so easy to do. It is so, I've done this so many times where I've been the one crying out, going, where are you? Do you hear anything that I'm saying? Draw near to me. God wanted Elijah to know that he could hear him and that he was there for him. And he wants you to know that. He wants me to know that he does hear you and he is there for you, but it may not be in the way that you expect. Because God is God, and that's why he doesn't always make sense to us. But God wanted Elijah to know that he was not alone. And he wanted him to know that he had never actually been alone. So the story goes on, 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. It says, go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. So Elijah gets up, he goes to the mountain. And the Lord passed by and stood there. The Lord passed by and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. So you can imagine, you're like begging to hear from God. And you're like dying to hear from him. So he says, go do this. So you go do that. And then a giant windstorm comes. You're like, oh my God, it's happening. It's right here. It's right now. Yay, finally shows up. It was such a terrible blast. The rocks were torn loose. But the Lord was not in the wind. You're like, all right, wind, strong winds, rocks falling. This is it. This is it. Nothing. It goes on. After the wind, there was an earthquake. So you're like, all right, now we're finally there. After the wind, there was an earthquake. The Lord was not in the earthquake. You're going, come on, that's like the biggest thing. That's like the one natural disaster we have in this area. This must be it. This must be the sign that I'm looking for. This must be how you're going to speak to me, is through this. But he was not in the earthquake. Poor Elijah, I feel so bad for him. So the story goes on, verse 12. And after the earthquake, there was a fire. Like, okay, a fire. Like, come on. Like, we don't even have matches. Like, how did this happen? There's a fire now. Surely, I remember Moses. Oh, that's it. Yes, like he did for Moses. I get it now. The burning bush, it's happening again, but this time with me, but the Lord was not in the fire. I mean, picture this poor guy just like standing there. You told me to stand here. All this stuff has happened and still nothing for me. And there's so much we can draw from this. But I think today as Christians, especially if you're a churchgoer, you go pretty regularly, we can make the same mistake that Elijah made, and that God is always in the big things. He always shows up and the big conferences and the big worship services. That's where he is. He's in a big building that has a cross on it. That's where it always happens. It's whenever it's that communicator, that special one. Or it's when it's that special worship team. It's when it's that group of people. When it's that's where God is. I think we make the same mistake looking for God in the same things. He's in the fire. He's in the earthquake. He's all this. And God does show up in all of that. But we want to lock God into that. So then God shows up in a very unexpected way in verse 13. It says, and after the fire, I love this. There was a sound of a gentle whisper. So the wind had died down, the fire was gone, the earthquake had stopped moving. Elijah was standing there silent. And he heard the sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. I don't know what all that God whispered to Elijah. You can see it moved him. Literally, he moved. I mean, he went and was like, whoa. I think this is true for me. I think it would be fair to say it's true for most of us. Sometimes I think it's hard for us to hear from God because our lives are lived so loud, we would never hear a whisper. Our lives are lived so fast, we'd never hear a whisper. Like he would only be able to speak to us if it was through fire or earthquake or those big jarring events that take place in life where the ground is shaking beneath our feet. And now he can finally speak to us because now he finally has our undivided attention. Have you ever been guilty of that? I know I have. If life is smooth, I don't even know if I need to hear from God. Life is good. And those big moments, the earthquakes and the fires and the winds, I mean, they just press us into God like nothing else, right? But then so often, the winds die down, the ground stops shaking beneath our feet, and the fire goes away, and we just go on with life. We live too loudly. We live too quickly to sometimes just hear the sound of a gentle whisper. Even when we feel like we're not hearing from him, let us never deduce wrongly that he is not there with us, that he is not there for us. Because God is love, and he loves you. In Romans 8, Paul writes a letter to a group of Christians living in Rome. And he writes these beautiful words I think could be incredibly encouraging for us. He says, "For I am convinced," this was just settled in his heart because this was a man that knew of grief. This was a man that knew of trouble. This is a man that had a bounty placed on his head because of his faith in Jesus. He said, "For I am convinced that nothing can ever separate us from his love. Death can't, and that's the hope of everyone that puts their hope in Jesus, that when they die, they resurrect with him, to be with him. Death can't, and I love this, but even life can't. Even when there's hell on earth, it can't separate you from his love for you. The angels won't, and all the powers of hell itself cannot keep God's love away." And this is so important. It cannot keep his love away from you even if you don't feel it. Even if in the moment you can't see it. It does nothing to change that. Our fears for today are our worries about tomorrow. He goes on. Or where we are, high above the sky or in the deepest ocean, nothing will ever be able to separate us from the love of God demonstrated by our Lord Jesus Christ when he died for us. That is what we can hold on to. One of many things is the love of God. He is a way maker, even when we can't feel it, even when we can't see it. And the waiting, as Tom Petty said in one of his songs, is the hardest part. So what can you do to remind yourself that God is near you and for you, even when you don't feel like you're hearing from him? I mean, there's lots of ideas. We can talk about worshiping and praying and meditating on his word and memorizing verses and living transparently and living authentically in community with others. One thing you can do is take this memory verse home with you. We have it on the tables in the back. I want to read it to you. It's also found in Romans chapter 8. You can put this somewhere where you can see it every day. So we are convinced that every detail of our lives, every detail, it doesn't matter what it is, every detail of our lives is continually woven together. He's up there going, all right, I'm going to take this part of your life. That's hard. I'm going to do something. I'm going to weave it. I'm going to make something into it to fit God's perfect plan for bringing good into our lives. For we are his lovers who have been called to fulfill his design purpose. If you need to know that, take a picture of that, write that down, grab it on one of the black tables in the very back of this room, put it on your dashboard, put it on your mirror, put it somewhere where you need to read it and see it, because he's weaving it together. We just always can't see it being woven together. And I wish I would have brought it with me so you could see it for yourself, but I'll just tell it to you now. My son, who's 9, got a Star Wars Connect the Dot books from his aunt, my sister. And so don't think Connect the Dot book that you have seen. Think a Connect the Dot that has like sometimes 1,100 dots on one page. And because there's so many dots, he has to use a magnifying glass to see the numbers and to see the dot and to be, so I'll watch him there for hours. He's got his pencil out. And if I held it up to you before it was done and just showed you the dots, you'd have no idea what it was. You cannot see it, what the picture is. You cannot see what it's going to become. So there's Elijah, and I'll see him, and I'll come back like 30 minutes into it. I'm like, yep, no idea. And he has no idea. He's just following the numbers, connecting it. Then I'll come back an hour later. I'm like, that might be, I'm not sure. And then like an hour and a half later, it's like, oh, that's Luke and R2-D2. Wow, I didn't know that was there. That is so amazing. And as I thought about that, I said, man, that is often so much of what it's like to walk with God when things are going on in our life. We can't connect the dots. We don't see the full picture. He does. He knows what it is. And throughout our lives, as we walk with him, he's like, okay, now I'm going to connect this to connect that. And we look at it and go, I don't see what you're doing here. And he's like, I'm up to something that you can't see. One day you will see when you're with me, and maybe even on this side of eternity, you'll see what I was up to. But right now, just keep praying, keep seeking, slow down, get silent, get quiet, connect some dots. The picture will become clear. So, we want to invite all of our Crossroads, all 3 of our campuses this week to do something. How many of you here today, and you would raise your hand and say, life isn't making sense right now in some way. God isn't making sense right now in some way. It's tough. It's hard. I'm going through some challenging times. I can relate to Elijah to some degree. Raise your hand. Be proud. Lots. Keep it up. Okay, lots of us. Okay, keep them up. How many of you right now, there is someone near to you in your life that you love that is feeling that way? Raise your hand if you know you can. All right, so that's just about most of us, almost all of us. Okay, here's what I want you to do. And I want to do this well because I don't want to oversell this. But we're going to ask Crossroads campuses to do a 3-day fast this week, Wednesday through Friday. If you don't know what fasting is, it's a spiritual discipline where you fast something. It's typically, in the Bible, it's usually always food. But and you use that time. I'll put it this way. You know how sometimes we don't pray enough or do things enough because we just forget, like because we're moving so fast? There's nothing like a hunger pain to remind you, like, oh yeah, pray, right? So it's like when you fast something, it's kind of like this, wherever you go, there's a reminder every time you're like, ooh, I'm hungry. Ooh, oh, I should, okay, pray. So fasting is a great way just to help you focus, help you quiet down, and help you to take time to pray for yourself, for the person that is you raised your hand for, to get with God and ask him tough questions and wrestle with these things. So you can fast food. Some of you, all you heard was fast food. By the way, if you ever do a fast, don't end it by eating fast food. I did that. That was bad. All right, so you can fast food for the 3 days. Maybe some of you, there's obviously, we're not going to get all crazy and super religious about this. Like some of you need to take some food, eat some food, to take some medication. God understands, right? So maybe you fast a meal. Maybe you're like, no breakfast for me. Now, if you never eat breakfast, that doesn't count, all right? Or maybe you're like, I'm not going to do breakfast and lunch. I'm only going to eat dinner, or vice versa, or not at all. I know Rob just went on a 3-day no food fast. I did a 3-day no breakfast and lunch fast, and then went crazy at night. And so you can fast a meal. Some of you, if you fasted this, it could kill you. You might die. So, be careful. Don't just, some of you are like, I'd rather fast food or sex than that. You're like, I would rather do that. You're like, Don't mess with my screen time. So that would be a huge one. Now, it doesn't mean, you can't answer your boss on your phone or whatever, but maybe you just go, if it's not like the bare minimum essentials that I don't lose my job or, can't find out where my kid's at, then maybe it's screen time. Maybe you're just going to go busyness. You're like, you know what, kids, we're not doing a million things these 3 days. We're not going to go a million places 3 days. We're just going to sit around and you can deal with it, and I'm going to sit here and you're going to sit there. So what is it for you? But we want to invite all of you to play. All of you to play. You don't even have to be a Christian to play. Just if you're not a Christian, what you should do is fast and then pray to God that he would make you one. Maybe you would want to follow him. I don't know. You don't have to, but he's great. He's awesome. He loves you. He is loved. So Wednesday to Friday, we're going to send this out on social media, and so you can see it. And then what we'd like to do is on Friday night at this campus, what we do, and we haven't even figured this out because we just talked about it like at 9 o'clock last night, is we want to open the doors of this room, have music playing in the background on, through the computer, and we're just going to open up for people to come and pray. Pray for you. Pray for your family. Pray for the person you raised your hand for. You can do that at home. He doesn't have to be here. But if you were like, you know what, I'll probably do it if I have more people around me doing it, we'll end our fast by coming here together and praying. So that'll be Wednesday through Friday. That's upcoming. But I want to pray for you now. And I want to thank you for being here. And please go back onto YouTube, Crossroads Go, if you want to catch up with some of the other parts of the series. But would you mind standing? Would our prayer teams please make their way to the front? If you would like prayer from any of your friends here, they